Welcome to Grounded Engagement, Liberating Leadership. My name is Kristina Katayama, and this show is built around the belief that liberating the leader within each of us with grounded presence and confidence rather than fear is both possible and necessary. The leader I'm most drawn to are the ones who found a way to stay open and curious in the middle of tension, who've learned that the hard moments aren't problems to eliminate. They're the exact territory where real leadership begins. My guest today is one of the people who made that way of thinking available to all of us. Barry Johnson is the founder of Polarity Partnerships and the originator of Polarity Thinking, a body of work that has quietly changed how thousands of leaders and organizations navigate complexity. I've been shaped by this work, and I'm genuinely honored to have you as a guest today, Barry. Welcome to Grounded Engagement.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Kristina. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to just explore this stuff with you together.
Yeah, I'm so excited. And, we've had some time to talk a little bit beforehand. And for this interview, I'd like to start someplace a little bit different. Rather than starting with the origin story, I'm curious to hear about what's most alive for you in this work right now. What is it that you're seeing or experiencing or thinking about that has you energized?
Well, the thing that I think is most important to me right now is recognizing the threat to our democracy in terms of a couple of key polarities that are important with any leadership or in any organization, regardless if it's a mom and pop shop or if it's a nation state. And that is, on the one hand, providing direction, and on the other hand, including participation. And the way that shows up in our governance here within our democracy is an executive branch and a legislative branch. And I think the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence had some good notions in mind about the notion of inclusion. How do we include people's voices? We didn't want another king around, but we did want to have that sort of executive function of providing direction, somebody who's a leader at the top. But so we had a president, and the question was, how do we keep the president from becoming a king? And the answer was, well, let's create a Congress, a Senate, and a House, and let's also have a Supreme Court, have a judicial system. And so the notion was about both claiming power and sharing power, and those leaders who claim power and share power are more effective for the benefit of the system they're leading, are more effective than someone who's claiming power without sharing power, because it invariably leads to an abuse of power, which I think is happening now with the current president of the United States. And so what I'm trying to do right now, in real practical terms, is I'm trying to lend whatever support I can in terms of time and energy and a little bit of money to try to empower the legislature and to see if we can get enough Democrats elected in the midterms, so that there be people who be willing to essentially balance out that power balance and force for the legislature to claim its power while understanding they need to share it with the president. But it would be claiming power with the intent to share. So that's where all my spare time energy is going right now, is just in trying to make that happen. Because I think if there is not a shift in the power structure in terms of the legislature being willing to claim power, then I think we're in real trouble as a country, and the impact on the world is very clear, already showing up in all sorts of ways, by just things like dropping out of the World Health Organization or other sort of executive actions without the backing of Congress.
So, Barry, can you share a specific moment where claiming power and sharing power showed up most clearly?
Well, let me think. There are sure.
And this would just to give, our listeners a sense of, well, what does that actually look like? And if there's specific
Sure.
moment
The one really good example I think is the suffragette movement. So for years, many years, women were struggling. Since right after for very early, women were attempting to claim power, which was to claim the right to vote. Now, when women wanted to claim the right to vote, they were claiming power with the assumption that, of course, it would be shared. They weren't suggesting that women have the right to vote and men would lose the right to vote. Right? It isn't trying to get power over men, but it was a an effort to say, we have a right to vote. We should have a right to vote, and so that was claiming the power of the vote. And they worked at it forever. When they did get the power to vote, they were in fact automatically set to share it. And that's, I think that's one great example. One other example, similarly, is when Black South Africans, who had a majority population but didn't have the vote at all, when Mandela and de Klerk, excuse me, when they um, uh, when they negotiated, Mandela initially from prison, Mandela gets out of prison, and they negotiate how they would have election in which all Black South African citizens of voting age would get the right to vote. And then when they got the right to vote, and Mandela became elected in the very first election after they did have the right to vote, Mandela was not about claiming power over white South Africans and denying them the vote, or taking over their businesses and telling them, no, Black South Africans are going to run everything. So it was that, but so in both cases, the notion was about claiming power with the intent to share. There are other countries within the southern Africa in which there was a white minority that was controlling, and those who claimed power, the Black indigenous people of Africa, did tend to claim power over, and that led to kind of a repressive response. So it's a huge difference when you look at those South Africa from some of the other countries in which the majority population took over from a dominant white minority population.
Thank you. And if we can, thinking about, you've been in the room with leaders and organizations where polarity thinking had genuinely landed, not just as a concept, but as a way of being. And I'd love to hear you describe what that looks like. What is it that you notice in a leader who's really got it?
There are one example is a man by the name of Tim Arnold, who started a program for it was for homeless people. He did it with his congregation, and the congregation was shrinking. It didn't have any younger, newer families showing up. It was getting older and older, and they were trying to figure out what to do. And in the process, they thought, maybe what we ought to do is, rather than worry about just our membership, we ought to just look at what we learned from our own theology in terms of taking care of the those less fortunate. And so they went to various agencies in town, including city government, and said, is there an area where help is needed, that is sort of being overwhelming right now. And if our church would put its shoulder to the wheel, they might be able to help. And they heard from a number of people, both not-for-profit organizations and the local city government. This was St. Catharines, Ontario, that the homelessness, the unhoused, or whatever the politically correct language is for it right now, there were people, didn't have a place to sleep at night, and adequate shelter. And so what they decided to do was create that. And they looked around. They found a school that had been closed up for various reasons. They had this school building that had been closed, and they were able to purchase it relatively cheaply. And then the whole congregation got behind renovating the school building into a place where people without homes could provide. And then what they did was he identified 5 key polarities that were fundamental to that. He thought he would spend a year with those polarities and see if there were others that showed up, or if that seemed to work. He had shared what polarities were with the congregation, talked about them, and they came up with 5 key polarities. And then they taught everybody who came in as a volunteer. Had over 300 volunteers working with us, and every person who came in from the into the shelter to be taken care of, they were all taught polarity thinking, and the 5 core polarities that were essentially the bedrock for that for the shelter. And so everybody knew about polarity thinking, and they and it ended up being just a great place. As a matter of fact, it had so much positive energy with it and it was on some land. The school property was bigger than just the school facility itself. It had playground area and space like that. So they set up some gardens, but they ended up building their church on some of the property next to that building, so that all be connected. And so that was a great example of somebody who was intentional going in about looking at key polarities and them generating them.
And what do you think allowed Tim to get there as a leader?
Well, Tim was very, very open the first time he came to see me. He had heard about polarity thinking, and he just wanted to spend some time with me learning about it. And so he was very open to learning new things from people, and I just happened to be one of them, and it immediately made sense to him. It fit with his theological base around the notion of justice and mercy, from that background. So what happens is, if people can make a connection to something that is already self-evident to them, they already appreciate that it's true, that there are some things that both end is required. And so sometimes working with parents, for example, and their kids, they know on the one hand that they want to care for their kids, they love them. It's some version of unconditional love. You're my child, I care for you regardless. And there are things that are not okay. You don't disrespect me. You don't hit your sister upside the head with a stick. So there are some version of justice and mercy is at play, and accountability and unconditional love, and that shows up in a lot of times people, their first connection that makes sense to them is in their thinking about dealing with their own children as parents.
So that's great. Thank you so much. So there's a moment that I'm hearing you talk about, a moment of awareness when it occurs that these two things can be true, right? Um, like you said, justice and mercy, or accountability and unconditional love. So have you witnessed a moment like that with a leader or an organization? And where is it that you could almost see that shift happening real time? Like, what was that like?
Well, it's really fun when it happens. And where it often happens is there's really two settings in which that awareness makes sense, and the two settings where polarity thinking is most useful. One is them in addressing resistance to change. It may be your own personal change, or it may be an organizational change, and there's a kind of stuckness, and the person is trying to, or the organization is trying to move from a situation that they find not acceptable or problematic to a situation that's a preferred future. It'd be better if we looked more like this. And so they're wanting to move from a present state that they're dissatisfied with to a preferred future state. And what's true with all of those is the underlying polarity of stability and change is there, first of all. But there will be probably another underlying polarity when they define what their problem or concern is. Then they also can identify where they want to go. And when I talk with them about that, we look at it, the possibility that where they want to go from is actually the downside of a pole of a polarity, and where they want to go to is the upside of the other pole. And so if we imagine a polarity being like an infinity loop, which is like a figure 8 laid on its side, you're going from the downside of one pole to the upside of the other. And the resistance to that move is coming from people who are afraid that they're going to lose the upside of the pole they're on, and they're afraid they're going to get caught in the downside of the pole they're going to. So, for example, working with a large corporation that were one of their strongest values was to have autonomy for their business units. And they were located, it was a multinational corporation located in 46 countries. And I was on the phone interviewing them, and they wanted me to come and do a presentation. They were bringing their top about 200 people from around the world to a celebration. It was kind of just celebrating and acknowledging a lot of the progress that they had been making, and how just to give some awards. And in the part of the celebration, they wanted to build in a learning piece for it, so there'd be not only just celebration but also some kind of leadership development. And I had done some work with a few parts of that organization, and so I'm on the phone with them talking about, they wanted me to come in a couple of months, and as they were sharing this 4-day event in which I was going to have a half a day, they said, we want you to understand what our theme is for this particular gathering. And they said it's leading through values. And my response to them was, well, I think that's terrific, because we're talking about leadership, we're talking about values. I think that will fit really well for the half day that I've got, because I look at values coming in pairs, and they show up as the two upsides of a polarity. So we can be looking at leadership in terms of value pairs, and we look at organizational value pairs, and I said that seems like it's going to work really well. And the chief operating officer, who was on the call, he said to me, "Wait a minute, Barry, are you saying that values come in pairs?" And I said, "Yes, sir. I think they often do." And so when I'm working with an organization, and if they're just starting up and they start articulating their values, vision, values, and objectives, and if they're articulating their values, I encourage them to think of them in terms of pairs. So, for example, if you just to use the metaphor of inhaling and exhaling, if they had a list of values and they had inhaling as a value, I'd look at the rest of their values list to see if they had exhaling. And if they didn't, I'd suggest, I think you ought to add exhaling, not because I've got anything against inhaling, but inhaling without exhaling is just not sustainable. And so I described this to him, and I said, if they already have a list, that's what I do, is I make sure that both poles are in the list. And he said, wait a minute, if you're going to be messing with our values list in front of our top 200 people, I want to know what you do with it. And so I want to share the values with you right now, and let's talk about it. And I said, okay. So they gave me a short list, and I'm looking at it, and they said, so here's our list. So what do you think? And I said, well, I think it seems like a great list of values. I said, one of them that strikes some concern for me is that you've got autonomous business units as a value. And I said, you don't have anything in your values that looks like integrated business units or coordination or centralized integration. So he said, so what do you make of that? And I said, well, your organization is experiencing or will experience, redundancy, excess competition between the units, a sense of silos, and just a lot of frustration, communication issues. I said, and at some point, you're going to identify that as a problem. When you do, you're going to bring your business unit heads together across these 46 countries and your executive team, and you're going to agree that you need to go to more integration of your business units, more collaboration. And then I said, and then you're not going to go there. Now, there was, in terms of an eye-opening moment, there was silence on the other end of the phone, right? There were 3 executives from this company on the phone. And I paused for a little bit, and I said, hello? and there was finally, in a real gruff voice, the CEO of the company, he said, who have you been talking to? And I said, I haven't been talking with anybody. I said, but I know how values work in pairs and how polarities work. And so it's quite predictable that you wouldn't walk your talk on this one. And he said, well, I want to know how you knew that, because 2 years ago, now this everybody would recognize the name of this company if I shared it. It's again located in 46 countries. So he said, 2 years ago, I held the meeting with the head, with all of our business unit heads from around the world, here in this office that I'm calling from. And we agreed to the person. Everyone on the executive team, all the business unit heads agreed that we needed to go towards more integrated business units. And we have hardly moved an inch in 2 years. Now, I want to know how you knew we weren't going to walk our talk. And I said, well, this would be a great focus for when I'm coming in a couple of months to spend 4 hours with the group that's coming. And so I did end up exploring that further, and I did make a presentation, and we worked on a polarity, which ended up being autonomous business units and integrated business units. And how would I know that they would get in trouble and that they would get into the downside of one pole, and that when they decided to get out, that they would probably not get there? And the answer is that gap analysis, there's 2 things that people would arrive at this issue with. First is an either-or mindset and a problem-solving mindset. This is a problem we need to solve, and so we're looking for a solution. And the other thing is they would use a typical change theory, which is what's called gap analysis, which is pretty basic for all change theories, some version of it. You've got a present state that you're not completely satisfied with, and you've got a preferred future state that you think would be better, and then you've got a strategy to bridge the gap between the present state and the preferred future. Now, if what you are bothered about is the downside of one pole of a polarity, and the natural solution is the upside of the other pole, so it's smart at one level. If you've been inhaling for a while, there's going to be a point at which you're going to automatically say, I need to exhale now, because inhaling is not enough. I've got to exhale. And so there's a natural self-correction in all polarities. When you experience the silos of autonomous business units, you want to move towards integration of those business units. But why wouldn't you go? The answer is that it's a movement within an ongoing oscillation of a polarity. It's an energy system that flows from the downside of one pole to the upside of the other, and then eventually you get to the downside of the pole you move towards, which drives you back towards the upside of the pole you started from. So this energy is moving through that infinity loop. So when they had autonomous business units as a value, the reason they had it as a value located in 46 countries is because there's all sorts of upsides to having autonomy in your business units. You can be responsive to the local culture. I mean, you need to run a business differently in Brazil than you do in France than you do in the United States. There's different cultures, different languages, different issues you need to incorporate. So you need to have some autonomy in order to be responsive to the local situation and to be responsive to customers. And you can't keep checking back with corporate in the United States every time you want to do something. You need that autonomy for those business units to really be fast and to be responsive. And so that was the upside that caused them to have autonomous business units as a value in the first place. But that historical upside to the over-focusing on to the neglect of integration led to them being stuck. Now, when they decided that they were stuck and they wanted to move towards integration, what was keeping them from moving is their fear. It was an unconscious fear of the downside of moving towards integrated business units, which is that they would lose their speed and responsiveness and they'd be caught in all sorts of bureaucracy. And so the unconscious fear of bureaucracy was keeping them from doing what their head said they needed to do. We need to have more integrated business units. So at the head level, that was what they knew they needed to do and agreed to do. At the gut level, which is at the cultural level, they were just not going to do it. And all of that was predictable from a polarity perspective. So in any event, this is a story in which the aha hit them. And when I went there 2 months later, we had all 200 people sitting around table groups of 6, all working with the same polarity map on a flip chart. And they had autonomous business units and integrated business units, and then they generated content. What is the upside of each and what's the downside of each? And then what would be action steps that would help us hold on to our autonomous business units? And then what would we also do in order to get integrated business units? And what happened here was the first thing we did after they generated the map was we talked about all the things they're going to do to make sure they hold on to the autonomy of their business units. Then we talk about what they can do in order to also integrate those business units, which will keep their autonomy while also increasing their integration. So that whole shift in the assumption that you can do both of these things. We can have highly effective autonomy, spontaneous, fast decision making, and high responsiveness with all of our business units, and have them work as a synergistic, integrated whole. That's something that you can do both. You don't have to choose. It's a false choice. It's a version of centralization and decentralization. Shows up in every organization of 2 people or more.
We're just jumping right into my next question, right?
Okay.
Which is, with 50 plus years of this work, when you let yourself feel proud, not for the recognition, but for what's actually moved in the world because of what you've built, what comes to mind?
Well, it's real clear. It's feedback from people who found it useful. People who have done wonderful things that I haven't been involved in at all. They've taken the basic understanding they got from me or from somebody else, maybe third or fourth hand, and I get a report back. Well, I learned this from so and so, who learned it from so and so. So it could be, 3 or 4 degrees of separation between me and them, but they're doing great work with it. That's the thing that makes me most proud and most excited. And there's just some very exciting, wonderful work that's being done around the world that I just get, I guess, hear about by people who will send me an email or something and thank me, and I don't know them, or I don't know the person that they learned it from. But they found it useful. So people finding it useful, that's one thing. The other thing that's most exciting is a fresh perspective on it. So and that can be as current as today. So today I was reading. I read every day the Meditations of Richard Rohr, and I was reading that this morning in anticipation of this meeting. The Action and Reflection, the Center for Action and Reflection, and in that in this particular morning meditation, he referred to W.B. Du Bois. Some pronounce it Du Bois, but W.B. Du Bois, black leader, who wrote one of the things that he wrote about in terms of addressing slavery was what was called dual consciousness. And I wasn't aware of him talking about dual consciousness until I just read it this morning. And that's the other thing I get excited about is learning about people who I respect or who I didn't know about, but who were way back when were talking about polarities, talking about interdependent pairs. They may not have used the word. He talked about the essence of the necessity for dual consciousness. And what he meant by dual consciousness was the consciousness that you have, your perception of reality, and the other's perception of reality. And you need to be able to hold both. And so, because that's the way to gain wisdom from the other. And so it's a self-other polarity, but the assumption was that there was something to be learned and something to be benefited by what he called dual consciousness. And so he's talking about polarities and about its importance in addressing slavery way back when. And there's, I heard about this, trying to remember her name now. It's a saint from the 1200s. Can't know her name, but she talks about polarities and the fundamental essence of polarities in faith tradition, and so now I'm getting it, from 1200, and then you kick back to yin and yang energy, and that's like 4,000 years old. So the richness of the tradition of our interdependent pairs and our universal interdependence is as old as time. And so I get excited whenever I get reminded of that, how long this has been around and how rich the tradition is of and the polarity map and principles is very congruent with it's just my effort to say from my experience how to find it useful for other people, and it's not new to the universe.
Got it. Thank you. So if someone is listening to this conversation right now, a leader who feels the tension that you've been talking about and wants what you've been describing, what would you want them to know? Not as advice, just as one human who's lived this to another.
Well, I'd want the person to know two things. One is that they are loved unconditionally and they're accountable for their actions and inactions. The other thing I'd want them to know is that they are unique And so they don't have to do anything to become unique. They were born unique, and they become more unique, will continue to be more and more unique as long as they live. And they're connected. They're a part of a world of interdependence. They were born connected, and they get more, their interdependence gets clearer and clearer as they age. So their uniqueness and their interdependence is something that grows. It's there from the beginning. They don't have to go after it. It's just there. They're already unique and they're already connected, so they don't have to work at it. Just hopefully to appreciate the fact that both of those things are true.
Beautiful. Thank you. And just one last question.
Yeah.
That I like to ask all of my guests.
Yeah.
What is a question that I haven't asked yet that you would like to be asked?
How does this fit with your personal theology?
So how does this fit with your personal theology?
Okay. So there are a couple of key events in my own personal theology. And when I was raised in a very conservative Lutheran church, and I was very afraid of going to hell as a child because I was the fire and brimstone sort of preacher up front. And so I was afraid that I was going to go to hell and trying to figure out how to not do that. And it wasn't by being good enough. You couldn't be good enough. It had to be. The whole thing was, Lutheran church was about faith and having. But I realized that faith was just sort of believing the right thing, so it was a kind of doing. So I was really caught. And then there was a point when I was 16 when I became aware there was a counselor there at one of those campfires you have in the evening at a Bible camp type situation. That's what I was in, where I realized it was like an awareness that I was loved just as I was. I didn't have to go someplace to be loved. I was loved just as I was. And it was shocking, and it was relieving, and it was wonderful. And as I lived with that, though, I thought that was just about me. What about everybody else in the world? And so I struggled with that. Just sort of, I was really involved, still planning. I thought I was going to be a Lutheran minister from age 13 to 26. In that time period, though, another emergence showed up for me in terms of my theology just expanded. I had what I would now call a mystical experience. At the time, I just called it an awareness. It wasn't a rational sort of argument. Well, this is true, therefore this is true, therefore this is true. It was an awareness of just like a bolt that came to me. And that is that in the classical going to heaven or going to hell thing I was raised in, the message was no one's going to hell, and that quote, everyone is saved. And so I wrote a short book. I was 25 years old. Let me see. No, I was 23 years old, and I wrote a book called All, really short, saying essentially from classical terms, everybody's saved. That's the message. That divine unconditional love overcomes everything, including our most worst behaviors. And so I wrote a book called All, and I stayed with that. I went on to seminary, and then I followed this course through Gestalt training I talked about and all that stuff. And then most recently, I got clear as a part of this interdependency, the interdependent pair. I've gotten more and more in touch with our universal interdependence. And so the book that I wrote called And is like a bookend to the other bookend of two books. So one book is All, quote, everybody's saved, nobody's going to hell. And the second book, which is And it's that there's an And which talks about our universal interdependence, and the smallest interdependence is two, A and B, you and me. But the universal interdependence is about everyone and everything, or all. So I went through that cycle, and that's why the notion of and our universal interdependence being a manifestation of divine unconditional love fits with the awareness when I was just graduating from college, when I was still 22. So that's where I'm at today, and I'm glad you asked.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Grounded engagement, liberating leadership. Beautiful. Thank you so much. And Barry, where would someone find more information if they wanted to learn more about your offering? And I will also be sure to include it in the show notes so that folks will have those links.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's just go to polaritypartnerships.org is one way, and look for the book and that would be another resource. And you can also just give me a call or a text or something, and I'd be glad to respond to it. So
okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Barry. Again, I'm Kristina Katayama, and this is Grounded Engagement, Liberating Leadership, and Stay in the Possibility.
Thank you.